Welcome to the Pheno Flick.
Welcome to the next edition of our Pheno Flicks. Today we're going to be going over black pearl mushrooms, or as we like to call them, pubos. A little bit about this strain in particular. Black pearls are a little funky. They were actually a breeding project from a company called Hiyoko Toko. I didn't look it up before. By a company Hiyoko Noko. By a company Hokuto Tanoko. And they were a Japanese company. Kanoko. I wrote it down. Hokuto. You
can just say the Hokuto company.
Hokuto Kanoko. Okay, I'll just mouth it out. Okay. So this strain was developed as a breeding project by the company. And they decided to cross a European and an Asian species of Pleurotus ostreatus and develop the black pearl mushroom. But some people think or have suspicions that maybe it was a Pleurotus orangi or a king oyster mushroom that they breeded with the Pleurotus ostreatus, just because the morphologies of the mushroom start a little king oystery and then eventually evolve into the nice pearl shape that we all know and love. When we are starting with this strain, again, we're gonna have our cryo set up. That's where everything here starts. So we've gone over it before, but anyways, we'll just do a quick recap. Boom, inoculate an agar dish, pour some grain around it, let the mycelium take over the dish as normal. When it gets to that grain, make sure it fully colonizes the grain and starts to move on a little bit. And then from here, we know that the mycelium has most likely fully taken over that grain and its insides, because inside of the grain, rye berry, which is what we use, the structure, its cell structure inside actually provides cryoprotectant properties as well as just being a good carrier for the mycelium. So boom, let that grain get fully taken over, wait for the mycelium to move on a little bit, and now we can deem that grain ready to cryopreserve. We don't want to let it sit for too long at that stage because mushrooms will just keep eating, so it'll eventually turn that into mush and get rid of that cell structure that's providing some of the protection. Boom, and then we have that fully colonized grain. Next, we're gonna have our cryo vial. It's just a little plastic vial, about 5 milliliters is as much as it holds. And inside of there, we're gonna put about 3 mils of our cryoprotectant solution, which is just a 10% glycerol solution by volume. So 3 mils of solution in total, 0.3 mils of glycerol inside of each of these vials. And that is just a standard cryoprotectant solution that's used across the entire mushroom industry and biologics, just to help preserve the cell structure. So the way glycerol works, the water molecules come around the glycerol instead of letting the water molecules connect to themselves. So when freezing, they're all around that instead of making these big, large structures of ice, because that's mainly what damages our cells. So we have our fully colonized grain, we have our cryo vial. You get that grain, sterilize your tool, and simply toss it into our vial. We want to make sure that the grain is fully submerged inside of our solution. This just makes sure that the mycelium is taking up and having that glycerol solution inside of all of its cells. So we boom, toss in, 10 grains or 5 to 10 grains, shake it up a little bit just to make sure that they're all nice and covered, and boom, into the -80 degrees cryo freezer. Next, when we are ready to expand onto our agar plate, we simply grab our cryovial that's desired, we grab our petri plate that's desired, and in this case for our oyster, our black pearl mushroom, it will be a PDYA solution or a potato dextrose yeast agar. And this is just a standard agar that's used across the mushroom industry. Thank you, tip of the cap. That is who we are currently using. Congratulations on your child. So yes, PDYA is the type of plate we'll use, just a potato dextrose plate. And so we get our grain, you sterilize your tool, grab our grain out of that vial, place it just nice and in the center of our plate, just to allow for an even radial growth, right? If we stuck it over here, this side of the mycelium is just gonna hit the wall and then stop and maybe just try to survive while the rest of the mycelium is just focused on taking over the plate. We just want the whole thing worried about spreading, and then also this provides the most outer range that we're gonna be cutting from. So you have your grain, you put it on there, and we like to keep it inside of the flow hood for about 3 to 5 days over the weekend or a week. And this just helps the mycelium that's in that grain kind of go, oh, okay, I'm in a new environment. I need to switch up my enzymes, my food source is different. They make that switch, they spread off the grain, establish on the plate, and then once that's happened, then we're ready to move the plate, seal it up, and let it sit in our incubation. So that first 3 to 5 days while it's establishing, that's gonna be at about 80 to 85 degrees on average, or just a standard incubation temperature. In those 3 to 5 days, we won't see too much growth, but oysters do move quickly on a plate as well. So it wouldn't be odd to maybe get a good couple inches of mycelial growth that have appeared on that plate after those first 3 to 5 days. Then we're gonna seal it up, move it over into our incubation space where it'll be stored at about 65 to 70 degrees. And in here, it's just gonna keep taking over that plate. And like with other oyster mushrooms, the black pearl will have a very nice, easy to identify thread that is coming out, or mycelium that's coming off of our grain. It'll be thick, it'll be white, it'll be easy to see, and it'll grow nice and clearly out. And it'll just keep growing like that all the way until it hits the outer edge. It won't really start densing up or fluffing down. It'll still be kind of connected to the plate and just crawling over, taking it across. And it should be a very nice and even growth going across that entire plate. So if we're rotating our agar quickly, we would like to catch the mycelium about 1 centimeter away before it hits our outer edge, or our wall as I like to call it, because once it hits the wall, it's no longer thinking about cell division and spreading. It's just gonna fluffen up and make its mat denser and denser. And with black oyster mushrooms, this plate's on the older side, so there is no negative space in between the lid and the agar itself. Usually with most strains, you'll see a little space of air, but since this plate's a little old, it's run up the walls and it's fluffed all the way up to kind of fill in any empty space it can get. Even if we're at this stage, it's still good to spawn with. If we kept it going a little longer, there's a little evidence of it starting to happen on this plate, but you'll start seeing some yellowing happening around the plate, and maybe even some little yellow metabolites that are coming off the plate. At that point, we wouldn't recommend using it, but our kind of standard rule is after 3 months, we don't use the agar anyways. It's small, it's easy to refresh, we have enough of an inventory, and it's just not worth it down the line because, right, this is going to make our 6 to 12 G1 Masters, and those will go down to make the 12 spawn bags to the 20 this. So if we mess it up here, or we have a bad plate here, we've possibly just ruined an upwards of 240 bags. When we are going to cut, it is just like all of our other species. We are just following that outer edge all the way around, as that outer edge is where the most cell division is occurring. We want to put it into a spawn bags where it will just keep cell dividing and eventually take over that bag. So we just follow around that outer edge, about 1 centimeter squares all the way around. And if we're doing 2 cuttings, it'll just be 2 of those squares in a 4-pound grain bag. So just a little smaller than this guy, 1 on the front, one on the back, and ideally having the agar cube on the face of the bag so that it's easy to identify that growth, right? If the agar cube was just in the center, we wouldn't actually know how it's doing or if it's even taking off. And so from this plate, we will get, if we're trying to max out, we'll get 12 4-pound grade masters. And that way we're not stressing about cutting any short on any distances of our cuttings on the plates, and they're all a nice uniform size. And then if we're trying to speed it along and do 4 cuttings, we'll only get about 6 4-pound masters out of that plate. We just use our standard mix for this grain, which is 3 parts rye with 1 part sorghum. And that's standard pretty much across all our species, except lion's mane. We've recently been having some success with oats. So in the grain stage for the masters, it's just a 4-pound master bag, and it's gonna start just growing nice and radially outside of our initial agar cutting. And this is gonna look wispy at first, but it will start to, it won't be wispy where you can't see it. It'll be like on our plate earlier, where it grows these nice white threads that you can see. You see them traversing along the bag and all along the grain. They're not hiding from you. And we let it sit there and grow that radially until about a week and a half. And with oyster mushrooms in this initial waiting to shake, you can have a pretty good amount of leniency, and even if we left it, it would eventually take over the bag. But as you'll maybe notice, if you keep it for about 2 weeks and haven't shaken it, it's going to be taking up that whole face of the bag, and it will start to mat up in the center of where that cutting originated. And at this point, we're thinking, oh, okay, well, it's moving along a little too quickly. We want it just to take over the whole bag and then start to thicken up. Because if we have these spots of thickness too early and there's still uncolonized parts of the bag, it'll just lead to very uneven spawning or just not a nice consistent bag to work with. So after about that week and a half, depending on your preference, we shake up the bag and we let it sit even longer in the incubation. Again, this incubation room is at about 65 to 70 degrees. And after that point, the oyster, the black pearl master bag will just start to densen up. It'll be all these individual pieces that are nice and myceliated, and it's just gonna take over the bag with those wisps and then just really start to densen up. So all those original grains before the shaken, you'll start seeing those turning a deeper white and almost like a pure white, and the parts that are still getting taken over will appear still a little more wispily. You'll still see the grains underneath, but it will take over the whole bag, and you'll start getting a really nice firmness onto our bags pretty early on as well. So about a week and a half, say we shook it after just that week, come the end of that next week, we would have a fully myceliated white bag, and it's doubling up everywhere. There shouldn't be really much wispiness. And so luckily oysters are very generous to us, and so we can keep it at that stage without refrigeration for about another week or 2 before we really have to move it along and get it refrigerated or spawned with it. And we have our nice fully myceliated white bag before refrigeration. Some things to look out for with black pearls is that they will like to form stroma if they get a little too hot or they're just stressed out. So it's important to make sure that we have nice even spacing between our 4-pound grain bags, and just to monitor each of the bags before you spawn with them, that there's none of these very hard discolored spots that are occurring in the bag, because once it's shifted that way, that stroma spot is going to stay as stroma. It's not going to reiterate back into wanting to spread or into mycelium. It's just trying to survive. So make sure that once the black oysters have fully taken over the bag, we don't let them sit for that big long 2-week period after, because you most likely will get some stroma. And another thing of note with other oysters, they'll maybe make like a skin of oyster material around the bag. The black pearls, they'll kind of start to, but it will all easily break up. Whereas if with an oyster bag, if we let it sit for too long, you'll just have these big kind of fleshy chunks inside of our grain bag. Our bag's fully myceliated, it's feeling firm. At this point, it's ready to spawn. When we go to spawn with these bags, right, we can spawn once it's initially fully myceliated and taken over the bag. But most of the time, just due to inventory, we shove them in the cold storage, and they can stay there for about a month, but you're gonna have maybe more prevalence of stroma and other instances of hardness or overlay. So you just want to double check those bags during that time period. But anyways, you have about a whole month which you could spawn with these bags before it's kind of a guaranteed no-go. So with our 4-pound master bag, we lay out our 12 6-pound grain bags, and then we just break it up and we try to evenly distribute that grain across all 12 6-pound bags. As mentioned before, we don't like to do less than 6 bags, as then we're just adding in a little too much and we might get some weird growth or old growth in some parts of the bag. And we also don't like to extend it past 24, as that way we're just stressing the mycelium out to spread too far, or it might just take too long. So again, we'll have an old part that's been in the bag for 2 weeks and maybe over here, there's still no myceliation occurring. So boom, inoculate those 12 bags, seal them all up, off to the incubation at 65, 70 degrees. Again, since these are a little more prone to the heat and stroma, we want to just make sure our bags are nice and evenly spaced across. And this is going to look very similar timelines to our grain master. It's just a slightly bigger bag. These are just going to sit on the shelf, and at first we'll see our initial grains that were from the master bag, and they're going to start spreading out, taking over the bag. At the end of that first week, this bag right here is only 7 days old, and there's already firmness, there's already squishiness. It's not cracking under my pressure. So, you know, maybe that first 4 days, you'll just have a white wisp, and then immediately it'll start to densen up and start forming that brick. So end of week 1, we've got pretty much a spawnable brick. It's nice and firm. It would be ready to be shipped off. We usually, if we're using them for our circumstances, we'll maybe keep them another week and then toss them into cold storage. And again, like mentioned earlier with the 4-pound master bag, they give us a lot of leniency. So even though it's good to go at this stage, you know, if we're short, we'll still ship this out to customers. It'll work perfectly. But a lot of the time we can keep it for longer, and so we can build up kind of a nice buffer zone to have. And again, it won't form that skin like a blue oyster does, so that's also what's providing us with some of that leniency. And then some differences compared to other oyster strains is that we'll start to get maybe splotches that are progressing a little farther along or seem a little harder. A lot of these aren't stroma that we're actually worried about. Black oysters will start to create kind of dense pillowy formations like on our agar plate. And so it's always easy enough to check by coming up and just giving a quick little poke. If it's not super hard or just right when you poke it, it just turns all yellow, then you're still good to go. The biggest thing mainly is just watching out for stroma with these bags, and it's very obvious. You'll see it in the denser zones. You won't get it in kind of a new myceliated zone. And also with our grain bags, we don't really experience a lot of auto fruiting with black oysters. It is mainly they'll go to stroma first before ever producing an auto fruit. And that's a little different because our other oyster strains, if we keep them in this grain bag too long, they'll start trying to make little auto fruits on the top or even on the bottom of the bag. They're just trying to find a way to escape, and they really like to move on. But this species will, as mentioned, kind of stay in that buffer zone for a good month or so inside of our cold storage or not. And again, anything leaving it in cold storage for a long time, you just have to be a little more thorough with checking it, make sure it's not damaged or anything. We haven't had any differences in whether it stays in a light or a dark zone. With a species like a lion's mane, they fruit a lot more when there's light appearing on them. The black oysters don't really seem to mind any of that too much. We've had them in cold spaces and light spaces, and they both have acted the exact same. And so once we have our fully myceliated, firm bag and it's ready to spawn with, we're gonna lay out our 20 10-pound substrate bags, break this one up, and distribute evenly.
Thank you, Gregor Jones, for all that wonderful information on the black pearl, the black oyster, the shimo furry, the cosmic queen. I'd like to take over now in this infomercial and discuss the inoculation, the incubation, the management, the visual characteristics of Black Oyster, the fruiting of Black Oyster, and some little nuances therein. Okay, and I'll interchangeably use Black Pearl, Black Oyster. Sorry, Alex, not gonna use Cosmic Queen. Other people call it Black King. We can cut this, Mike, this is stupid. It has way too many names. Let me just start over, that's bullshit.
I mean, if you would like to, but I'm gonna find a way to use all that.
Okay, all right. The Black Pearl. Again, we're boring here at Cap and Stem because we are just titans of industry. And so we have standardization across the board. We knock things at the same rate all the time. It's boring. But, you know, truth be told, there is, you know, empirical data. You know, there's actually informed recommendations as it pertains to inoculation rates in general. As far as my understanding of the topic, it's based off of, you know, the total percentage of the mass of the fruiting substrate taken up by your inoculum. To some extent, this has to do with the nutritional content of the spawn or carrier that you're providing. So, you know, rye or millet or whatever is quite potent on its own, but I really think it primarily has to do with by providing lots of inoculation points from the same organism, it is able to expend less energy in its exploration process of the fruiting substrate and reserve more of its energy towards metabolizing its fruiting substrate to thus yield more fruits faster, bigger, better, faster, stronger. With that in mind, there's a general recommendation. Don't quote me, Myco Wizards, but I want to say that it was about 2 to 5% in that range. So we typically do 20 blocks, 10-pound blocks for every 6-pound G2 bag. You're going to hear that a lot on these Pheno Flicks. We speak with farms who have good results doing more aggressive inoculation rates for various reasons, you know, down to 8 bags or so, and all the way up to, you know, 30. I tend not to recommend too much beyond 30 for 10-pound blocks. You know, the vigor of the fruiting substrate starts to decline after a certain point, and the incubation timeline gets extended beyond a point that you might find viable. Basically, if you want hot, fast, you know, colonization, then you'll do an aggressive spawning rate. If you like it slow and low, like a beautiful beef brisket, you know, you do something like 30 blocks. Black Oyster, Black Pearl, Shimo Furry, Cosmic Queen, Black King, the super awesome hybrid oyster mushroom, is one that is, in my anecdotal experience, a little bit more prone to adverse mutations depending on how you manage it. And that can extend to substrate incubation. You can see all kinds of adverse phenomena develop if your incubation is loosey-goosey, managed improperly. With that in mind, a key variable is to ensure that ambient temperature is monitored carefully and it doesn't get too hot. This is a variety that will demonstrate all kinds of problems if the ambient temperature exceeds, you know, if you're on a 10-pound block, the rule of thumb we're always giving is around 66 degrees Fahrenheit. Once you start to creep up from that, the internal heat when this substrate block is at its highest metabolic rate is far beyond what is healthy, and all kinds of bad things happen. Stroma, bacterial problems, slower time to pinset once you do cut it to fruit. But provided that you have good temperature regulation, you can expect a fully myceliated block that is at a point of being justifiable for fruiting in around 10 days. Black oysters, in our experience, are one that have a significantly longer grace period after it's fully myceliated, the fruiting substrate, before it actually starts forming pins. So You can kind of extend the time as needed based off of your schedule with your fruiting and all the other variables. You have a bit of breathing room, so somewhere in the like 10 days to 3 weeks or so, the block's going to be in a pretty stable condition in your fruit room. Eventually, it will get to a point where it will form pins in vitro, so don't extend that too long. Also, the longer that you let it sit, the more likely it's going to do what's colloquially called consolidation with oysters, where it'll form a really thick mat or myelin sheath and just basically be slow and reluctant to fruit. That's how you know you let it sat for too long. But all things being equal, our typical plan when we inoculate black oyster is about 12, 13 days until we box it up and send it to a farm. As far as the look, morphology, different traits exhibited of black oyster mycelium, it's pretty consistent with other Pleurotus ostreatus strains. It'll first form a relatively light white mycelium stretched across the growing medium, and then it will fluffify and become dense and like a brick. This is a good example. This is a block I picked up off the floor because it's been sitting for too long and has some pins in there. This is not a strain that, like some more classic blue oysters, for example, will form a really, really aggressive rubbery sheath. It will still form it, particularly at the top. But as you can see, just a dense but not exceedingly dense white mycelium. Black Pearl is a strain that is known for a higher preponderance of stroma in incubation. You will be able to spot that via, dense, often discolored, often kind of amber or orangish colored, very dense white mycelial, often circles. That is going to lead to poor performance in fruiting, lackluster yields, sometimes really funky ass looking fruits. That'd be one thing to bear in mind. Other than that, it's a pretty gentle oyster mycelium. If you're in a position where you are trying to refrigerate your black pearl blocks before you fruit them for whatever reason, they are one that are fairly stable in general and fairly stable before auto fruiting. So I'm not sure on the exact timeline that you could maintain, but at 34 Fahrenheit, you could reliably store these for several weeks before they'd be in a condition where they're really best not fruited. One other note on cold storage, this is a cold-loving strain of oyster, so eventually it will indeed auto-fruit. There are some strains that simply won't form fruit bodies in refrigeration just due to their temperament, whereas cold-loving strains like the Black Pearl will in due time form a pin set even in 34 degrees. People go about fruiting Black Pearl in quite a lot of different ways. Those who are very dialed in on trying to mimic the morphology of king oysters without all the attendant problems that king oysters present will often top fruit these. But truth be told, this mushroom does like to form a cluster, so that's usually not, in our experience, the recommended way to go. I recommend fruiting these much as you would most other oysters. Do a cross cut or a slit across the long surface of the block, not too deep, 1/4 of an inch or so, with a clean blade. And that will encourage a dense pin set that forms a very large, bountiful, proper looking Black Pearl cluster. As far as their performance, once you do bring them into fruiting and cut the blocks, this is a strain that's a little bit slower to form a pin set, and it has a very unique process it undergoes as it starts to fruit. It'll first form that classic aerial mycelium that starts to pillow out, almost like cobweb mold, outside, spilling out from that cut point into the block. Eventually what you'll see in about, depending on your conditions, 5 or 7 days on average, you'll start to see some amber colored metabolites form as little droplets on the outside of that aerial mycelium. That is soon going to give way to little tiny pins, little tiny primordia, recognizable as baby Black Pearl mushrooms. That process overall takes longer in terms of a time to pin set than most other oysters. However, black pearl, once it's gotten through that stage of initiation, is more or less on par with most other cold weather oyster strains in terms of how fast the fruit bodies go. Somewhere in the range of 10, 14 days, and you have mushrooms that are ready to harvest. Black pearl is a temperamental little baby in your fruiting room. People have all kinds of problems with it. It's one of those species that we speak with farms with very often for reasons associated with it not performing the way it used to in your fruiting environment. As mentioned, it is a cold-loving species. Once you start to exceed, give or take, the mid-60s range, its behavior and morphology in the fruiting environment starts to rapidly change. Its eagerness to form a pin set starts to drop precipitously the warmer it gets. So as a little hack, if you are in an environment where you just can't do anything about how hot it is in the summer in your fruiting environment, I'd recommend initiating these to form a pin set in the coolest environment you have available, even if that's not your fruiting room. People often have a pinning room for that purpose. Once it starts to get warmer as well, the morphology of the fruit bodies themselves starts to change drastically from what you might expect. Whereas in cold temperatures, you'll get a morphology that's much more akin to king oysters, just simply as a cluster rather than as individual cap and stem mushrooms. Once you start to get into warmer conditions, the fruits look quite a bit more like a typical blue oyster. You can still differentiate them, don't get me wrong. They still have fatter stems to them and a cap that isn't quite the same shape. But if you were looking at it from afar, it's going to look a lot more like a typical Pleurotus ostriatus. As far as recommended fruiting conditions, this is a strain that's best cultivated cold. Now, if you're going to cultivate it cold, that brings with it its own set of considerations about how you manage your environmental parameters. So I'd recommend fruiting this somewhere on the low end of 50 degrees if you really like a dense, slow growing, but high quality fruit, and not exceeding the low 60s ideally. One thing I should have mentioned earlier, as you get into those warmer conditions, the prevalence of bacterial blotch and other icky fruiting room problems starts to shoot up to the moon in those warmer conditions. But again, yeah, about 50 Fahrenheit, give or take 65 is the recommended range. Probably the ideal is somewhere in that 55 to 60 Fahrenheit range. In those colder conditions, that colder air can hold on to far less humidity. So for that reason, if you don't make any adjustments to your humidification schema, you'll often see condensation start forming in those colder conditions on the black oyster fruits. That's going to lead to all kinds of problems. On the more benign end, you're going to often see mycelium start to form out into open space from the caps themselves. That's just fruit body mycelium colonizing over, often organic matter saturated humidity that's settled as condensation on your fruits. The bigger end of the problem is with lots of condensation, that'll beget bacteria. Sometimes it'll even beget rose comb on black pearl, which is best avoided. So for that reason, in colder conditions, it's always a good idea to try to do what you can to have a higher atomization to your humidification. So as we talk about constantly, using something like a heart nozzle, aromas system, something that's a little finer as opposed to really big particle sizes for your humidification. As far as fresh air exchange, it's relatively run-of-the-mill. A standard recommendation of having your CO2 evac fan kick on somewhere in the 800s is probably best to not have excessive stem elongation. And just, it's pretty run-of-the-mill in terms of standard fruit room parameters as far as fresh air exchanges per hour are concerned. Standard all-spectrum lighting is fine. I think there's a lot of evidence to support the idea of using blue spectrum LED lighting. For oysters, it is pretty thoroughly known that that's really good for king oysters. So logic would have it that you'd probably have good results if possible with blue spectrum lighting with black pearl as well, but you know, it's really not that critical. You're gonna get nice looking fruits with nice color, nice shape to them with your standard all spectrum lighting regime. After harvest, black pearl has a fairly decent shelf life if harvested before those caps are overexposed and starting to elongate and flatten out. Not quite as beautiful and impressive as something like a king oyster, but still pretty decent. So they're a good quality mushroom for wholesaling. So in summation, black pearl, black king, cosmic queen, Shimo furry, the patented, very illegal black market jailbroke strain that we've been talking about here is a fantastic mushroom, and I recommend that you make it a part of your standard regimen in your fruiting operation. Most strains only go to 10, but this strain goes to 11. With that, I bid you adieu. Until next time, thanks for tuning in to Myco Wizards. He's a nice guy. I like this guy. Yeah. Get to know the truck drivers, you know. Seems like good dude.
Is Dennis still driving, or is he?
No, he's been shut down. I believe he's alive. But yeah, he just we got like a very sad call from the dispatch lady we talk to all the time from that company. Like, we had to, you know, Dennis like caused or almost caused way too many like accidents and stuff. You know, he was great. Yeah. You ever see him fall, like just that classic image he would actually do reliably of falling asleep with a cigarette like in his mouth, his head like dangling like he'd been half decapitated, you know, out the window.
I never saw it, but I did.
He was always like tossed into prison and shit for the night, you know, just like he's like the local guy, you know. They're like, oh, it's Dennis again. We'll get him, his wife will get him in the morning, or you know. Yeah, he was great. There's some good and some bad. There's a racist guy. There's a guy who kicked Wade. I wasn't here, but yeah. Yeah, no kidding. All right. We'll have to cut it again, I think, in a second. But all right, where were we? Inoculation rates. All right. Let's see what else. Are we supposed to be talking about yields? Is that on there?
I don't think.
That's probably best avoided. It's always,
Guarantees.
yeah. You're gonna yield a record amount of fresh mushrooms every time you work with cap and stem. All right.